Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I am back with some more freedom. Today we are going to be continuing our energetic investment into our union by reading aloud from the Federalist Papers. We will be doing Federalist Paper number 67, 68, 69, and 70 today, and they all deal with the executive department. So let's dive into Federalist Paper number 67. From the New York Packet, Tuesday, March the 11th of 1788, authored by Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. The Constitution of the Executive Department of the proposed government claims next our attention. There is hardly any part of the system which could have been attended with greater difficulty in the arrangement of it than this, and there is, perhaps, none which has been inveighed against with less candor or criticized with less judgment. Here, the writers against the Constitution seem to have taken pains to signalize their talent of misrepresentation, calculating upon the aversion of the people to monarchy. They have endeavored to enlist all their jealousies and apprehensions in opposition to the intended President of the United States, not merely as the embryo, but as the full-grown progeny of that detested parent. To establish the pretended affinity, they have not scrupled to draw resources even from the regions of fiction. The authorities of a magistrate, in few instances greater, in some instances less, than those of a governor of New York, have been magnified into more than royal prerogatives. He has been decorated with attributes superior in dignity and splendor to those of a king of Great Britain. He has been shown to us with the diadem sparkling on his brow and the imperial purple flowing in his train. He has been seated on a throne, surrounded with minions and mistresses, giving audience to the envoys of foreign potentates, in all the supercilious pomp of majesty. The images of Asiatic despotism and voluptuousness have scarcely been wanting to crown the exaggerated scene. We have been taught to tremble at the terrific visages of murdering Janissaries, and to blush at the unveiled mysteries of a future Seraglio. I don't know what that means. Attempts so extravagant as these to disfigure, or it might be said, to metamorphose the object, render it necessary to take an accurate view of its real nature and form, in order as well to ascertain its true aspect and genuine appearance, as to unmask the disingenuity and expose the fallacy of the counterfeit resemblances which have been so insidiously as well as industriously propagated. In the execution of this task there is no man who would not find it an arduous effort either to behold with moderation, or to treat with seriousness the devices, not less weak than wicked, which have been contrived to pervert the public opinion in relation to the subject. They so far exceed the usual, though unjustifiable, licenses of party artifice, even in a disposition the most candid and tolerant, they must force the sentiments which favor an indulgent construction of the conduct of political adversaries to give place to a voluntary and unreserved indignation. It is impossible not to bestow the imputation of deliberate imposture and deception upon a gross pretense of a similitude between a king of Great Britain and a magistrate of the character marked out for that of the President of the United States. It is still more impossible to withhold that imputation from the rash and barefaced expedients which have been employed to give success to the attempted imposition. In one instance, which I cite as a sample of the general spirit, the temerity has proceeded so far as to ascribe to the President of the United States a power by which the instrument reported is expressly allotted to the executives of the individual states. I mean the power of filling casual vacancies in the Senate. This bold experiment upon the discernment of his countrymen has been hazarded by a writer who, whatever may be his real merit, has had no inconsiderable share in the applauses of his party, and who, upon this false and unfounded suggestion, has built a series of observations equally false and unfounded. Let him now be confronted with the evidence of the fact, and let him, if he is able, justify or extenuate the shameful outrage he has offered to the dictates of truth and to the rules of fair dealing. The second clause of the second section of the second article empowers the President of the United States to nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not in the Constitution otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. Immediately after this clause follows another in these words: the President shall have the power to fill up vacancies that may happen during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session. It is from this last provision that the pretended power of the President to fill vacancies in the seat has been deduced. A slight attention to the connection of the clauses and to the obvious meaning of the terms will satisfy us that the deduction is not even colorable. The first of these two clauses, it is clear, only provides a mode for appointing such officers, whose appointments are not otherwise provided for in the Constitution, and which shall be established by law. Of course, it cannot extend to the appointments of senators, whose appointments are otherwise provided for by the Constitution, and who are established by the Constitution, and will not require a future establishment by law. This position can hardly be contested. The last of the two clauses, it is equally clear, cannot be understood to comprehend the power of filling vacancies in the Senate, for the following reasons. First, the relation in which that clause stands to the other, which declares the general mode of appointing officers of the United States, denotes it to be nothing more than a supplement to the other, for the purpose of establishing an auxiliary method of appointment, in cases to which the general method was inadequate. The ordinary power of appointment is confined to the President and Senate jointly, and can, therefore, only be exercised during the session of the Senate. But, as it would have been improper to oblige this body to be continually in session for the appointment of officers, and as vacancies might happen in their recess, which might be necessary for the public service to fill without delay, the succeeding clause is evidently intended to authorize the President singly to make temporary appointments during the recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of the next session. Secondly, if this clause is to be considered as supplementary to the one which precedes, the vacancies of which it speaks must be construed to relate to the officers described in the preceding one, and this, we have seen, excludes from its descriptions the members of the Senate. Thirdly, the time within which the power is to operate during the recess of the Senate and the duration of the appointments to the end of the next session of that body conspire to elucidate the sense of provision which, if it had been intended to comprehend senators, would naturally have referred to temporary power of filling vacancies to the recess of the state legislatures, who are to make the permanent appointments, and not to the recess of the national Senate, who are to have no concern in those appointments, and would have extended the duration in office of the temporary senators to the next session of the legislature of the state, in whose representation the vacancies had happened, instead of making it to expire at the end of the ensuing session of the National Senate. The circumstances of the body authorized to make the permanent appointments would, of course, have governed the modification of a power which related to the temporary appointments, and as the National Senate is the body whose situation is alone contemplated in the clause upon which the suggestion under examination has been founded, the vacancies to which it alludes can only be deemed to respect those officers in whom appointment that body has a concurrent agency with the President. But lastly, the first and second clauses of the third section of the first article not only obviate all possibility of doubt, but destroy the pretext of misconception. The former provides that the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years. And the latter directs that if vacancies in that body should happen by resignation or otherwise during the recess of the legislature of any state, the executive thereof may make temporary appointments until the next meeting of the legislature, which shall then fill such vacancies. Here is an express power given in clear and unambiguous terms to the state executives to fill casual vacancies in the Senate by temporary appointments, which not only invalidates the supposition that the clause before considered could have been intended to confer that power upon the President of the United States, but proves that this supposition, destitute as it is even of the merit of plausibility, must have originated in an intention to deceive the people, too palpable to be obscured by sophistry, too atrocious to be palliated by hypocrisy. I have taken the pains to select this instance of misrepresentation and to place it in a clear and strong light, as an unequivocal proof of the unwarrantable acts which are practiced to prevent a fair and impartial judgment of the real merits of the Constitution submitted to the consideration of the people. Nor have I scrupled, in so flagrant a case, to allow myself a severity of animadversion, or little congenial with the general spirit of these papers. I hesitate not to submit it to the decision of any candid and honest adversary of the proposed government, whether language can furnish epithets of too much asperity for so shameless and so prostitute an attempt to impose on the citizens of America. I really like the ending of this one. And so ends Federalist Paper number 67, where he calls out the simple-minded. He's like, hey, listen, it is so clearly defined that I cannot even believe that you are having this argument. So much so that he's like, what can we call this guy? Whether an honest adversary of the proposed government, whether language can furnish epithets of too much asperity for so shameless and so prostitute an attempt to impose on the citizens of America. I love that. Like, that is absolutely great. He's like, I cannot believe you are bringing this dumb shit up. That is absolutely wonderful from our founding fathers. I don't have a whole lot to add there, right? It was arguments about whether or not the president could permanently appoint a senator, right? And that is almost as baseless and as mindless as the arguments that we are getting now that if a certain candidate gets back into office, that he'll never leave. He's going to become a dictator for life. And it's like, no, that's literally not how we are set up to protect ourselves. If he was to do that, me, who has voted for him twice and will vote for him a third time, if he was to do that, I would be out there taking up arms. And I'm not a super cultist like some people are. Most people aren't. They just support the dude. Everybody calls them a cultist. But for the most part, most people aren't. They just see that the dude can get the job done, right? But if he got in there and he tried to be a dictator, don't think that we wouldn't be out there bleeding just as fast. It is what it is. The temerity of some people. Federalist Paper number 68. The mode of electing the president from the New York Packet, Friday, March 14th of 1788, authored by Alexander Hamilton, to the people of the state of New York. The mode of appointment of the Chief Magistrate of the United States is almost the only part of the system of any consequence which has escaped without severe censure, or which has received the slightest mark of approbation from its opponents. The most plausible of these, who has appeared in print, has even deigned to admit that the election of the president is pretty well guarded. I venture somewhat further, and hesitate not to affirm that if the manner of it be not perfect, well, it is at least excellent. It unites in an eminent degree all the advantages, the union of which was to be wished for. It was desirable that the sense of the people should operate in the choice of the person to whom so important a trust was to be confided. This end will be answered by committing the right of making it, not to any pre-established body, but to men chosen by the people for the special purpose, and at the particular conjuncture. It was equally desirable that the immediate election should be made by men most capable of analyzing the qualities adapted to the situation, and acting under circumstances favorable to deliberation, and to a judicious combination of all the reasons and inducements which were proper to govern their choice. A small number of persons selected by their fellow citizens from the general mass will be most likely to possess the information and discernment requisite to such complicated investigations. It was also peculiarly desirable to afford as little opportunity as possible to tumult and disorder. This evil was not least to be dreaded in the election of a magistrate, who was to have so important an agency in the administration of the government as the President of the United States. But the precautions which have been so happily concerted in the system under consideration promise an effectual security against this mischief. The choice of several to form an intermediate body of electors will be much less apt to convulse the community with any extraordinary or violent movements than the choice of one who was himself to be the final object of the public wishes. And as the electors chosen in each state are to assemble and vote in the state in which they are chosen, this detached and divided situation will expose them much less to heats and ferments which might be communicated from them to the people, than if they were all to be convened at one time in one place. Nothing was more desirable than that every practicable obstacle should be opposed to cabal, intrigue, and corruption. These most deadly adversaries of republican government might naturally have been expected to make their approaches from more than one quarter, but chiefly from the desire in foreign powers to gain an improper ascendant in our councils. How could they better gratify this than by raising a creature of their own to the chief magistrate of the Union? But the convention have guarded against all danger of this sort with the most provident and judicious attention. They have not made the appointment of the President to depend on any pre-existing bodies of men, who might be tampered with beforehand to prostitute their votes, but they have referred it in the first instance to an immediate act of the people of America, to be exerted in the choice of persons for the temporary and sole purpose of making the appointment. And they have excluded from eligibility to this trust all those who from situation might be suspected of too great a devotion to the President in office. No senator, representative, or any other person holding a place of trust or profit under the United States can be of the numbers of the electors. Thus, without corrupting the body of the people, the immediate agents in the election will at least enter upon the task free from any sinister bias. Their transient existence and their detached situation, already taken notice of, afford a satisfactory prospect of their continuing to the conclusion of it. The business of corruption, when it is to embrace so considerable a number of men, requires time as well as means. Nor would it be found easy suddenly to embark them, dispersed as they would be over 13 states, in any combinations founded upon motives, which, though they could not properly be denominated corrupt, might yet be of a nature to mislead them from their duty. Another, and no less important desideratum was that the executive should be independent for his continuance in office on all but the people themselves. He might otherwise be tempted to sacrifice his duty to his complaisance for those whose favor was necessary to the duration of his official consequence. This advantage will also be secured by making his re-election to depend on a special body of representatives, deputed by the society for the single purpose of making the important choice. All these advantages will happily combine in the plan devised by the convention, which is, that the people of each state shall choose a number of persons as electors, equal to the number of senators and representatives of such state in the national government, who shall assemble within the state and vote for some fit person as president. Their votes, thus given, are to be transmitted to the seat of the national government, and the person who may happen to have a majority of the whole number of votes will be the president. But as a majority of the votes might not always happen to center in one man, and as it might be unsafe to permit less than a majority to be conclusive, it is provided that, in such a contingency, the House of Representatives shall select out of the candidates who have the 5 highest number of votes, the man who, in their opinion, may be best qualified for the office. That's an interesting turn. The process of election affords a moral certainty that the office of the President will never fall to the lot of a man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications. We're going to let that sit for a second. The process of election affords a moral certainty that the office of president will never fall to the lot of a man who is not in an eminent degree endowed with the requisite qualifications, talents for low intrigue, and the little arts of popularity may alone suffice to elevate a man to the first honors in a single state, but it will require other talents and a different kind of merit to establish him in the esteem and confidence of the whole Union, or of so considerable a portion of it as would be necessary to make him a successful candidate for the distinguished office of President of the United States. It will not be too strong to say that there will be a constant probability of seeing the station filled by characters preeminent for ability and virtue, and this will be thought no inconsiderable recommendation of the Constitution by those who are able to estimate a share which the executive in every government must necessarily have in its good or ill administration. Though we cannot acquiesce in the political heresy of the poet who says, "For forms of government let fools contest, that which is best administered is best," yet we may safely pronounce that the true test of a good government is its aptitude and tendency to produce a good administration. The vice president is to be chosen in the same manner with the president, with this difference, that the Senate is to do, in respect to the former, what is to be done by the House of Representatives, in respect to the latter. The appointment of an extraordinary person as vice president has been objected to as superfluous, if not mischievous. It has been alleged that it would have been preferable to have authorized the Senate to elect out of their own body an officer answering that description. But two considerations seem to justify the ideas of the convention in this respect. One is that to secure at all times the possibility of a definite resolution of the body, it is necessary that the president should have only a casting vote, and to take the senator of any state from his seat as a senator and place him in that of the president of the Senate would be to exchange, in regard to the state from which he came, a constant for a contingent vote. The other consideration is that as the vice president may occasionally become a substitute for the president in the supreme executive magistracy, all the reasons which recommend the mode of election prescribed for the one apply with great, if not equal force to the manner of appointing the other. It is remarkable that in this, as in most other instances, the objection which is made would lie against the constitution of this state. We have a lieutenant governor chosen by the people at large, who presides in the Senate, and is the constitutional substitute for the governor, in casualties similar to those which would authorize the vice president to exercise the authorities and discharge the duties of the president. And so ends Federalist Paper number 68, and this is given a breakdown of how the Electoral College was intended to work, right? To some degree, it kind of still does. We are meant to vote for electors and not necessarily for the president. We are to choose electors who will choose the person that we want to vote for. Now, the way that we have determined to do that is by casting the vote for the president and then having the electors cast their votes according to the results of that election. It's probably a better system, but maybe not, because what the safeguard was supposed to be against was incompetence in office, and God knows we have that today. As of today, May the 22nd of 2024, we have an incompetent in the executive. You may not like me saying that, but if that is true, then you probably lean a little bit to the right, to the left. I'm not going to go so far as to talk about him drinking blood or doing any of the things of that nature, right? Some people do. It's not going to be me. But he is absolutely incompetent in all of his dealings. He has not done anything for this country which should be done for this country. And so, the Federalist Paper number 69. The real character of the executive, from the New York Packet, Friday, March 14th of 1788, authored by Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. I proceed now to trace the real character of the proposed executive as they are marked out in the plan of the convention. This will serve to place in a strong light the unfairness of the representations which have been made in regard to it. The first thing which strikes our attention is that the executive authority, with few exceptions, is to be vested in a single magistrate. This will scarcely, however, be considered as a point upon which any comparison can be grounded. For if, in this particular, there be a resemblance to the King of Great Britain, there is not less a resemblance to the Grand Seigneur, or to the Khan of Tartary, or to the Man of the Seven Mountains, or to the Governor of New York. That magistrate is to be elected for 4 years, and is to be re-eligible as often as the people of the United States shall think him worthy of their confidence. In these circumstances there is a total dissimilitude between him and the King of Great Britain, who is a hereditary monarch, possessing the crown as a patrimony descendable to his heirs forever. But there is a close analogy between him and the Governor of New York, who is elected for 3 years, and is re-eligible without limitation or intermission. If we consider how much less time would be requisite for establishing a dangerous influence in a single state than for establishing a like influence throughout the United States, we must conclude that a duration of 4 years for the Chief Magistrate of the Union is a degree of permanency far less to be dreaded in that office than a duration of 3 years for a corresponding office in a single state. The President of the United States would be liable to be impeached, tried, and upon conviction of treason, bribery, or any other high crimes or misdemeanors, removed from office, and would afterwards be liable to prosecution and punishment in the ordinary course of law. The person of the King of Great Britain is sacred and inviolable. There is no constitutional tribunal to which he is amenable, no punishment to which he can be subjected without involving the crisis of a national revolution. In this delicate and important circumstance of personal responsibility, the President of Confederated America would stand upon no better ground than a Governor of New York, and upon worse ground than the Governors of Maryland and Delaware. The President of the United States is to have power to return a bill, which shall have passed the two branches of the legislature for reconsideration, and the bill so returned is to become a law if, upon that reconsideration, it be approved by 2/3 of both houses. The King of Great Britain, on his part, has an absolute negative upon the acts of the two houses of Parliament. The disuse of that power for a considerable time past does not affect the reality of its existence, and is to be ascribed wholly to the Crown's having found the means of substituting influence to authority, or the art of gaining a majority in one or the other of the two houses, to the necessity of exerting a prerogative which could seldom be exerted without hazarding some degree of national agitation. The qualified negative of the President differs widely from this absolute negative of the British sovereign, and tallies exactly with the revisionary authority of the Council of Revision of the State, of which the Governor is a constituent part. In this respect the power of the President would exceed that of the Governor of New York, because the former would possess singly what the latter shares with the Chancellor and judges. But it would be precisely the same with that of the Governor of Massachusetts, whose constitution, as to this article, seems to have been the original from which the convention have copied. The President is to be the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states, when called into the actual service of the United States. He is to have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment, to recommend to the consideration of Congress such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient, to convene, on extraordinary occasions, both houses of the legislature, or either of them, and, in case of disagreement between them with respect to the time of adjournment, to adjourn them to such time as he shall think proper, to take care of the laws be faithfully executed, and to commission all officers of the United States. In most of these particulars the power of the President will resemble equally that of those of the King of Great Britain and the Governor of New York. The most material points of difference are these. First, the President will have only the occasional command of such part of the militia of the nation as by legislative provision may be called into the actual service of the Union. The King of Great Britain and the Governor of New York have at all times the entire command of all the militia within their several jurisdictions. In this article, therefore, the power of the President would be inferior to that of either the monarch or the governor. Secondly, the President is to be the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States. In this respect, his authority would be nominally the same as that of the King of Great Britain, but in substance much inferior to it. It would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces, as first general and admiral of the Confederacy, while that of the British King extends to declaring of war and to the raising and regulating of fleets and armies, all which, by the Constitution under consideration, would appertain to the legislature. The Governor of New York, on the other hand, is, by the Constitution of the state, vested only with the command of its militia and navy. But the constitutions of several of the states expressly declare their governors to be commanders-in-chief, as well of the army as navy, and it may well be a question whether those of New Hampshire and Massachusetts, in particular, do not, in this instance, confer larger powers upon their respective governors than could be claimed by a President of the United States. Thirdly, the power of the President in respect to pardons would extend to all cases except those of impeachment. The Governor of New York may pardon in all cases, even in those of impeachment, except for treason and murder. Is not the power of a governor, in this article, on a calculation of political consequences, greater than that of the President? All conspiracies and plots against the government, which have not been matured into actual treason, may be screened from punishment of every kind by the interposition of the prerogative of pardoning. If a governor of New York, therefore, should be at the head of any such conspiracy, until the design had been ripened into actual hostility, he could ensure his accomplices and adherents an entire impunity. A President of the Union, on the other hand, though he may even pardon treason, when prosecuted in the ordinary course of law, could shelter no offender, in any degree, from the effects of impeachment and conviction. Would not the prospect of total indemnity for all preliminary steps be a greater temptation to undertake and persevere in an enterprise against the public liberty than the mere prospect of an exemption from death and confiscation in the final execution of the design upon an actual appeal to arms should miscarry? Would this last expectation have any influence at all when the probability was computed that the person who was to afford the exemption might himself be involved in the consequences of the measure, and might be incapacitated by his agency in it from affording the desired impunity? The better to judge of this matter, it will be necessary to recollect that by the proposed Constitution the offense of treason is limited to levying war upon the United States, and adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort, and that by the laws of New York it is confined with similar bounds. Fourthly, the President can only adjourn the national legislature in the single case of disagreement about the time of adjournment. The British monarch may prorogue or even dissolve the Parliament. The Governor of New York may also prorogue the legislature of this Senate for a limited time, a power which, in certain situations, may be employed to very important purposes. The President is to have power, with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided two-thirds of the senators present concur. The King of Great Britain is the sole and absolute representative of the nation in all foreign transactions. He can, of his own accord, make treaties of peace, commerce, alliance, and of every other description. It has been insinuated that his authority in this respect is not conclusive, and that his conventions with foreign powers are subject to the revision and stand in need of the ratification of Parliament. But I believe this doctrine was never heard of, until it was broached upon the present occasion. Every jurist of that kingdom and every other man acquainted with its constitution knows, as an established fact, that the prerogative of making treaties exists in the crown in its utmost plenitude, and that the compacts entered into by the royal authority have the most complete legal validity and perfection, independent of any other sanction. The Parliament, it is true, is sometimes seen employing itself in altering the existing laws to conform them to stipulations in a new treaty, and this may have possibly given birth to the imagination that its cooperation was necessary to the obligatory efficacy of the treaty. But this parliamentary interposition proceeds from a different clause, from the necessity of adjusting a most artificial and intricate system of revenue and commerce laws to the changes made in them by the operation of the treaty, and of adopting new provisions and precautions to the new state of things, to keep the machine from running into disorder. In this respect, therefore, there is no comparison between the intended power of the President and the actual power of the British sovereign. The one can perform alone what the other can only do with the concurrence of a branch of the legislature. It must be admitted that, in this instance, the power of the federal executive would exceed that of any state executive. But this arises naturally from the sovereign power which relates to treaties. If the Confederacy were to be dissolved, it would become a question whether the executives of the several states were not solely invested with that delicate and important prerogative. The President is also to be authorized to receive ambassadors and other public ministers. This, though it has been a rich theme of declamation, is more a matter of dignity than of authority. It is a circumstance which will be without consequence in the administration of the government, and it was far more convenient that it should be arranged in this manner than that there should be a necessity of convening the legislature, or one of its branches, upon every arrival of a foreign minister, though it were merely to take the place of a departed predecessor. The President is to nominate, and, with the advice and consent of the Senate, to appoint ambassadors and other public ministers, judges in the Supreme Court, and, in general, all officers of the United States established by law, and whose appointments are not otherwise provided for by the Constitution. The King of Great Britain is emphatically and truly styled the Fountain of Honor. He not only appoints to all offices, but can create offices. He can confer titles of nobility at pleasure, and has the disposal of an immense number of church preferments. There is evidently a great inferiority in the power of the President in this particular to that of the British King. Nor is it equal to that of the Governor of New York, if we are to interpret the meaning of the Constitution of the state by the practice which has been obtained under it. The power of appointment is, with us, lodged in a council, composed of the governor and 4 members of the Senate chosen by the Assembly. The governor claims and has frequently exercised the right of nomination, and is entitled to a casting vote in the appointment. If he really has the right of nominating, his authority is, in this respect, equal to that of the President, and exceeds it in the article of the casting vote. And exceeds it in the article of the casting vote. In the national government, if the Senate should be divided, no appointment can be made. In the government of New York, if the council should be divided, the governor can turn the scale and confirm his own nomination. If we compare the publicity which it must necessarily attend the mode of appointment by the President and an entire branch of the national legislature, with the privacy in the mode of appointment by the governor of New York, closeted in a secret apartment with at most 4, and frequently with only 2 persons, and if we at the same time consider how much more easy it must be to influence the small number of which a council of appointments consists, than the considerable number of which the national Senate would consist, we cannot hesitate to pronounce that the power of the chief magistrate of this state in the disposition of offices must, in practice, be greatly superior to that of the chief magistrate of the Union. Hence, it appears that, except as concurrent authority of the President in the article of treaties, it would be difficult to determine whether that magistrate would, in the aggregate, possess more or less power than the governor of New York. And it appears yet more unequivocally that there is no pretense for the parallel which has been attempted between him and the King of Great Britain, but to render the contrast in this respect still more striking, it may be of use to throw the principal circumstances of dissimilitude into a closer group. The President of the United States would be an officer elected by the people for 4 years. The King of Great Britain is a perpetual and hereditary prince. The one would be amenable to personal punishment and disgrace. The person of the other is sacred and inviolable. The one would have a qualified negative upon the acts of the legislative body. The other has an absolute negative. The one would have a right to command the military and naval forces of the nation. The other, in addition to this right, possesses that of declaring war and of raising and regulating fleets and armies by his own authority. The one would have a concurrent power with a branch of the legislature in the formation of treaties. The other is the sole possessor of the power of making treaties. The one would have a like concurrent authority in appointing to offices. The other is the sole author of all appointments. The one can confer no privileges whatever. The other can make denizens of aliens, noblemen of commoners, can erect corporations with all the rights incident to corporate bodies. The one can prescribe no rules concerning the commerce or currency of the nation, and the other is in several respects the arbiter of commerce, and in this capacity can establish markets and fairs, can regulate weights and measures, can lay embargoes for a limited time, can coin money, can authorize or prohibit the circulation of foreign coin. The one has no particle of spiritual jurisdiction, and the other is the supreme head and governor of the national church. What answer shall we give to those who would persuade us that things so unlike resemble each other? The same ought to be given to those who tell us that a government, the whole power of which would be in the hands of the elective and periodical servants of the people, is an aristocracy, a monarchy, and a despotism. I'm not going to read the footnotes. You are welcome to go back and check those out, but so ends paper number 69. And here, this was just mainly a delineation, right? Is saying, no, we are not appointing a monarch. What we are doing is appointing a head of state. We need somebody to be able to make the snap decisions, to be able to meet one-on-one with heads of state, to be party of the negotiations subject to the consent of the Senate. And all of these things are clearly defined and shown to be differentiated from the monarchy in great measure. Now, the fact that they are meant to be elected however many times people find to be appropriate, we had to change that for Roosevelt, and if you don't know, there was a whole lot of controversy behind that when it happened. We're not going to get into that subject today, but if you're interested, let me know, and we will dive into that at another point. And now we're going to do Federalist Paper number 70. The Executive Department further considered from the New York Packet, Tuesday, March 18th of 1788, authored by Alexander Hamilton to the people of the state of New York. There is an idea, which is not without its advocates, that a vigorous executive is inconsistent with the genius of republican government. The enlightened well-wishers of this species of government must at least hope that the supposition is destitute of foundation, since they can never admit its truth, without at the same time admitting the condemnation of their own principles. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws, to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice, to the security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy. Every man, the least conversant in the Roman story, knows how often that republic was obliged to take refuge in the absolute power of a single man, under the formidable title of dictator, as well as against the intrigues of ambitious individuals who aspired to the tyranny, and the seditions of whole classes of the community whose conduct threatened the existence of all government. as against the invasions of external enemies who menace the conquest and destruction of Rome. There can be no need, however, to multiply arguments or examples on this head. A feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. A feeble execution is but another phrase for a bad execution, and a government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government. Taking it for granted, therefore, that all men of sense will agree in the necessity of an energetic executive, it will only remain to inquire what are the ingredients which constitute this energy, how far can they be combined with those other ingredients which constitute safety in the Republican sense, and how far does this combination characterize the plan which has been reported by the convention? The ingredients which constitute energy in the executive are: first, unity; secondly, duration; thirdly, an adequate provision for its support; and fourthly, competent powers. The ingredients which constitute safety in the Republican sense are: first, a due dependence on the people; secondly, a due responsibility. These politicians and statesmen who have been the most celebrated for the soundness of their principles and for the justice of their views have declared in favor of a single executive and a numerous legislature. They have, with great propriety, considered energy as the most necessary qualification of the former, and have regarded this as the most applicable to power in a single hand, while they have, with equal propriety, considered the latter as best adapted to deliberation and wisdom, and best calculated to conciliate the confidence of the people and to secure their privileges and interests. The unity is conducive to energy will not be disputed. Decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch will generally characterize the proceedings of one man in a much more eminent degree than the proceedings of any greater number, and in proportion as the number is increased, these qualities will be diminished. This unity may be destroyed in two ways: either by vesting the power in two or more magistrates of equal dignity and authority, or by vesting it ostensibly in one man, subject in whole or part to the control and cooperation of others, and the capacity of counselors to him. Of the first, the two consuls of Rome may serve as an example. Of the last, we shall find examples in the constitutions of several of the states. New York and New Jersey, if I recollect right, are the only states which have entrusted the executive authority wholly to single men. Both these methods of destroying the unity of the executive have their partisans, but the votaries of an executive council are the most numerous. They are both liable, if not equal, to similar objections, and may in most lights be examined in conjunction. The experience of other nations will afford little instruction on this head. As far, however, as it teaches anything, it teaches us not to be enamored of plurality in the executive. We have seen that the Achaeans, on an experiment of two praetors, were induced to abolish one. The Roman history records many instances of mischiefs to the republic from the dissensions between the consuls and between the military tribunes, who were at times substituted for the consuls. But it gives us no specimens of any peculiar advantages derived from the state from the circumstance of the plurality of those magistrates. That the dissensions between them were not more frequent or more fatal is a matter of astonishment, until we advert to the singular position in which the republic was almost continually placed, and to the prudent policy pointed out by the circumstances of the state and pursued by the consuls, of making a division of the government between them. The patricians engaged in a perpetual struggle with the plebeians for the preservation of their ancient authorities and dignities. The consuls, who were generally chosen out of the former body, were commonly united by the personal interest they had in the defense of the privileges of their order. In addition to this motive of union, after the arms of the republic had considerably expanded the bounds of its empire, it became an established custom with the consuls to divide the administration between themselves by lot, one of them remaining in Rome to govern the city and its environs, and the other taking the command in the more distant provinces. This expedient must, no doubt, have had great influence in preventing those collisions and rivalships which might otherwise have embroiled the peace of the Republic. But, quitting the dim light of historical research, attaching ourselves purely to the dictates of reason and good sense, we shall discover much greater cause to reject than to approve the idea of plurality in the executive, under any modification whatever. Wherever two or more persons are engaged in any common enterprise or pursuit, there is always danger of difference of opinion. If it be a public trust or office, in which they are clothed with equal dignity and authority, there is a peculiar danger of personal emulation and even animosity. From either, and especially from all these causes, the most bitter dissensions are apt to spring. Whenever these happen, they lessen the respectability, weaken the authority, and distract the plans and operation of those whom they divide. If they should unfortunately assail the supreme executive magistracy of a country, consisting of a plurality of persons, they might impede or frustrate the most important measures of the government in the most critical emergencies of the state. And what is still worse, they might split the community into the most violent and irreconcilable factions, adhering differently to the different individuals who compose the magistracy. Men often oppose a thing merely because they have had no agency in planning it, or because it may have been planned by those whom they dislike. But if they had been consulted and have happened to disapprove, opposition then becomes, in their estimation, an indispensable duty of self-love. They seem to think themselves bound in honor and by all the motives of personal infallibility to defeat the success of what has been resolved upon contrary to their sentiments. Men of upright, benevolent tempers have too many opportunities of remarking, with horror, to what desperate lengths this disposition is sometimes carried, and how often the great interests of society are sacrificed to the vanity, to the conceit, to the obstinacy of individuals who have credit enough to make their passions and their caprices interesting to mankind. Perhaps the question now before the public may, in its consequences, afford melancholy proofs of the effects of this despicable frailty, or rather detestable vice, in the human character. Upon the principles of a free government, inconveniences from the source just mentioned must necessarily be submitted to in the formation of the legislature, but it is unnecessary and therefore unwise to induce them into the constitution of the executive. It is here, too, that they may be most pernicious. In the legislature, promptitude of decision is oftener an evil than a benefit. The differences of opinion and the jarrings of parties in that department of the government, though they may sometimes obstruct salutary plans, yet often promote deliberation and circumspection, and serve to check excesses in the majority. When a resolution, too, is once taken, the opposition must be at an end. That resolution is a law, and resistance to it is punishable. But no favorable circumstances palliate or atone for the disadvantages of dissension in the executive department. Here they are pure and unmixed. There is no point at which they cease to operate. They serve to embarrass and weaken the execution of the plan, or measure to which they relate, from the first step to the final conclusion of it. They constantly counteract these qualities in the executive, which are most necessary ingredients in its composition, vigor, and expedition, and this without any counterbalancing good. In the conduct of war, in which the energy of the executive is the bulwark of the national security, everything would be to be apprehended from its plurality. It must be confessed that these observations apply with principal weight to the first case supposed, that is, to a plurality of magistrates of equal dignity and authority of scheme, the advocates for which are not likely to form a numerous sect. But they apply, though not with equal, yet with considerable weight, to the project of a council, whose concurrence is made constitutionally necessary to the operations of the ostensible executive. An artful cabal in that council would be able to distract and to enervate the whole system of administration. If no such cabal should exist, the mere diversity of views and opinions would alone be sufficient to tincture the exercise of the executive authority with a spirit of habitual feebleness and deleteriousness. deleteriousness. But one of the weightiest objections to a plurality in the executive, and which lies as much against the last as the first plan, is that it tends to conceal faults and destroy responsibility. Responsibility is of two kinds, to censure and to punishment. The first is more important of the two, especially in an elective office. Man, in public trust, will much oftener act in such a manner as to render him unworthy of being any longer trusted, than in any such a manner as to make him obnoxious to legal punishment. But the multiplication of the executive adds to the difficulty of detection in either case. It often becomes impossible, amidst mutual accusations, to determine on whom the blame or the punishment of a pernicious measure or a series of pernicious measures ought really to fall. It is shifted from one to another with so much dexterity and under such plausible appearances that the public opinion is left in suspense about the real author. The circumstances which may have led to any national miscarriage or misfortune are sometimes so complicated that where there are any number of actors who may have had different degrees and kinds of agency, though we may clearly see upon the whole that there has been a mismanagement, yet it may be impracticable to pronounce to whose account the evil may have been incurred is truly chargeable. I was overruled by my counsel. The council were so divided in their opinions that it was impossible to obtain any better resolution on the point. These and similar pretexts are constantly at hand, whether true or false. And who is there that will either take the trouble or incur the odium of a strict scrutiny into the secret springs of the transaction? Should there be found a citizen zealous enough to undertake the unpromising task, if there happen to be a collusion between the parties concerned, how easy it is to clothe the circumstances with so much ambiguity as to render it uncertain what was the precise conduct of any of those parties. In the single instance in which the governor of this state is coupled with the council, that is, in the appointment of offices, we have seen the mischiefs of it in the view now under consideration. Scandalous appointments to important offices have been made. Some cases, indeed, have been so flagrant that all parties have agreed to the impropriety of the thing. When inquiry has been made, the blame has been laid on the governor, by the governor, on the members of the council, who, on their part, have charged it upon his nomination, while the people remain altogether at a loss to determine by whose influence their interests have been committed to hands so unqualified and so manifestly improper. In tenderness to individuals, I forbear to descend to particulars. It is evident from these considerations that the plurality of the executive tends to deprive the people of the two greatest securities they can have for the faithful exercise of any delegated power. First, the restraints of public opinion, which lose their efficacy as well on account of the division of the censure attendant on bad measures among a number, as on account of the uncertainty on whom it ought to fall. And secondly, the opportunity of discovering with facility and clearness the misconduct of the persons they trust, in order either to their removal from office or to their actual punishment in cases which admit of it. In England, the king is a perpetual magistrate, and it is a maxim which has obtained for the sake of the public peace that he is unaccountable for his administration and his person sacred. Nothing, therefore, can be wiser in that kingdom than to annex to the king a constitutional council, who may be responsible to the nation for the advice they give. Without this, there would be no responsibility whatever in the executive department, an idea inadmissible in a free government. But even there the king is not bound by the resolutions of his council. Though they are answerable for the advice they give, he is the absolute master of his own conduct in the exercise of his office, and may observe or disregard the counsel given to him at his sole discretion. But in a republic, where every magistrate ought to be personally responsible for his behavior in office, The reason which in the British Constitution dictates the propriety of a council not only ceases to apply, but turns against the institution. In the monarchy of Great Britain, it furnishes a substitute for the prohibited responsibility of the chief magistrate, which serves in some degree as a hostage to national justice for his good behavior. In the American Republic, it would serve to destroy or would greatly diminish the intended and necessary responsibility of the chief magistrate himself. The idea of a council to the executive, which has so generally obtained in the state constitutions, has been derived from the maxim of republican jealousy, which considers power as safer in the hands of a number of men than of a single man. If the maxim should be admitted to be applicable to the case, I should contend that the advantage on that side would not counterbalance the numerous disadvantages on the opposite side. But I do not think the rule at all applicable to the executive power. I clearly concur in opinion, in this particular, with a writer whom the celebrated Junius pronounces to be deep, solid, and ingenious, that the executive power is more easily confined when it is one, that it is far more safe there should be a single object for the jealousy and watchfulness of the people, and, in a word, that all multiplication of the executive is rather dangerous than friendly to liberty. A little consideration will satisfy us that the species of security sought for in the multiplication of the executive is attainable. Numbers must be so great as to render combination difficult, or they are rather a source of danger than of security. The united credit and influence of several individuals must be more formidable to liberty than the credit and influence of either of them separately. When power, therefore, is placed in the hands of so small a number of men as to admit of their interest and views being easily combined in a common enterprise by an artful leader, it becomes more liable to abuse, and more dangerous when abused, than if it be lodged in the hands of one man, who, from the very circumstance of him being alone, will be more narrowly watched and more readily suspected. And who cannot unite so great a mass of influence as when he is associated with others? The decemvirs of Rome, whose name denotes their numbers, were more to be dreaded in their usurpation than any one of them would have been. No person would think of proposing an executive much more numerous than that body. From 6 to a dozen has been suggested for the number of the council. The extreme of these numbers is not too great for an easy combination, and from a combination America would have more to fear than from the ambition of any single individual. A council to a magistrate who is himself responsible for what he does are generally nothing better than a clog upon his good intentions, and often the instruments and accomplices of his bad, and are almost always a cloak to his faults. I forbear to dwell upon the subject of expense, though it be evident that if the councils should be numerous enough to answer the principal end aimed at by the institution, the salaries of the members, who must be drawn from their homes to reside at the seat of government, would form an item in the catalogue of public expenditures too serious to be incurred for an object of equivocal utility. I will only add that prior to the appearance of the Constitution, I rarely met with an intelligent man from any of the states who did not admit, as a result of experience, that the unity of the executive of this state was one of the best of the distinguishing features of our Constitution. And so ends Federalist Paper number 70, and here we get pretty much just a reason why it should be the power invested in a single person. It is easier to determine who is taking the illegal acts if it is confined to a single person. Now, the powers of the president are severely limited. He is commander-in-chief of the active duty military. He can be given the power over the militia, but he has power over the currently serving military. He has the power with the Senate to make treaties and to meet and direct our foreign policy, but all of that is subject to other powers. He can't create any laws on his own. He can't create any offices on his own. He can't do the things like he can appoint to the offices, but he doesn't make the offices. other people do that. So it's not up to the executive to do those things. The power is limited. He is to be our national head. He is supposed to be a qualified member of our society with success to his name. We don't have that currently. He has no success to his name in his entire history. It would be much worse, however, were we to have a national council of people associated with the current head, right? The people who were, just take it for this administration, the current one. Hillary Clinton would be in that, right? You would have probably Barack Obama in that. You would have several of the key players who have driven this into the ground. But instead of being able to hold Biden accountable, we would be lost as to who was the true one running the country. It would be really amazing if something like that were to happen. Our Constitution is supposed to be our safeguard. The measures that we have in place are supposed to be the safeguard. But the key safeguard, once again, is the electorate. It is up to us to say, no, this is absolutely unacceptable. I will not tolerate this candidate. But we don't. And so that's where we're going to wrap this one up. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment and not too much confusion to a somewhat difficult topic. This dealt mostly with the executive. It outlined the powers held within and the powers not granted to. It talked about holding them accountable and how we should be doing that. I will leave the link down below if you want to go back and read it for yourself. I always recommend that you read it for yourself so that you know whether or not I am telling you the truth. I have it right here for you to look at as I read along, but that may not be enough. Go back, check it out for yourself. Understand the meat of the situation. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you were here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt's Tea. Peace.